Colonel Richard Briggs snatched the identification badge from Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Carter's chest, with both hands right there on the tarmac in front of every soldier who had gathered to watch, and he threw it onto the ground like it was garbage. Her teammates, still bleeding from wounds they had carried home across 8,000 miles, stood in stunned silence. Briggs pointed at the gate and said 4 words loud enough for the entire base to hear. "Get her off base." If you believe loyalty and sacrifice deserve something better than this, subscribe to our channel right now. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from, and stay with us until the very last word. This story is going to leave you breathless. Part 1. The military transport touched down at Camp Macall just before dawn, and the sound of its engines pulling back should have felt like relief. For Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Carter, it felt like coming back from the edge of something she still could not fully name. 17 days in country, a mission that had come apart in ways nobody in the planning room had anticipated. 3 separate firefights. A vehicle ambush that left 2 of her operators with wounds serious enough to require immediate surgery. And through all of it, every single member of her 12-person special operations team had made it back breathing. Not intact, not unbroken, but alive. Every single one of them alive. That was supposed to mean something. She stepped off the ramp first the way she always did, because a team commander steps off first and boards last, and that is not a regulation you learn from a manual. That is something that gets carved into you over years of watching the right people lead and the wrong people fall apart. Her left shoulder was bandaged beneath her uniform. She had taken a fragment wound during the 3rd contact, and the forward surgical team had done what they could, but she had refused evacuation because 2 of her operators were in worse shape, and there was only 1 bird available, and that bird was going to carry them, not her. That decision had already been logged. She had the paperwork. Her team came down the ramp behind her. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, 29 years old, arm in a temporary sling jaw, set hard the way it always was when he was in pain and refusing to admit it. Petty Officer First Class Diana Okafor, moving carefully because 3 of her ribs were cracked from a blast concussion, but moving under her own power, chin up. The others filed out behind them, some limping, all of them wearing the particular kind of exhaustion that does not go away with sleep. It goes away only when you have enough time and enough quiet, and operators rarely get either. Evelyn had expected a medical team on the tarmac. She had expected the routine of post-mission protocol. Debrief scheduling, weapons check-in, immediate medical triage for her injured personnel. What she got instead was military police. 6 of them standing in a formation that was clearly deliberate, clearly rehearsed, positioned in a way that was meant to communicate authority and control. And standing in front of them, wearing the expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment with genuine pleasure, was Colonel Richard Briggs. Evelyn had met Briggs twice before. Both times had been brief, formal, and uncomfortable in the specific way that interactions with men who resent your existence tend to be uncomfortable. He was the base commander at Camp Macall, a position he had held for 2 years, and in those 2 years, he had developed a reputation among the special operations community that was not flattering. He micromanaged. He second-guessed field commanders with no field experience of his own. He treated elite operators like subordinates in need of constant correction rather than professionals who had spent careers mastering skills he could not perform. And he had a particular problem which everyone in the community knew about, and nobody said aloud in official settings, with the idea that a woman could hold command authority over a mixed special operations element and be better at it than most men who had tried. Lieutenant Commander Carter, his voice carried across the tarmac with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. You will surrender your sidearm and your identification to the MP on your left. You are hereby relieved of command pending investigation of multiple protocol violations. Behind her, she heard Marcus Webb make a sound that was not quite a word. Sir. Evelyn kept her voice completely level. My team has wounded personnel requiring immediate medical attention. Whatever administrative matter you need to address with me can be addressed after my people are... Your people, Briggs said, cutting her off with a precision that suggested he had practiced this, are no longer your responsibility. Effective as of this moment, you have no command. You have no authority. You have no standing on this installation. The MP will take your weapon and your ID, and then you will be escorted to the gate. The MP to her left stepped forward. Evelyn did not move. For 3 seconds, nobody on that tarmac breathed. "Sir?" Her voice was still level. "I have a right to know the nature of these alleged violations before I surrender equipment." Briggs stepped closer. He was taller than her by several inches, and he clearly intended for that to matter. "You violated the chain of command by initiating contact with civilian defense contractors during an active operation. You deviated from your approved mission parameters on 3 separate occasions, and you made unauthorized communication with personnel outside your operational authority." He paused, letting each charge land. "Should I continue? Were any of those deviations documented as having prevented casualties?" Evelyn asked. "That is not the relevant question." "I would argue it is exactly the relevant question, Colonel." Briggs looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained something beyond professional disapproval. It was personal. It had always been personal with him, and they both knew it. He reached out and took her identification badge from her chest with both hands and dropped it on the ground between them. MP, her weapon. Marcus Webb stepped forward from behind her. "Sir, with respect." "Staff Sergeant." Briggs turned the full force of his attention on Webb. "You are still a member of this military. You will stand down, or you will find yourself in this same situation. Do you understand me?" Webb looked at Evelyn. She gave the smallest shake of her head. He stood down. The MP took her sidearm. Another MP collected the identification from the ground, and Evelyn watched a man bend down to pick up something that represented 12 years of her life, everything she had built and earned and proved, and hand it to a colonel who had never once proven anything in a place where proof was paid for in blood. "You are banned," Briggs said, loud enough to carry to the soldiers who had gathered at the edges of the tarmac, "from every installation under my authority. Effective immediately. Any attempt to return to this base or any associated facility will result in your arrest." He looked at her team. "Anyone who has contact with her outside of official channels will be subject to disciplinary review. That is not a suggestion." He turned to go. "Colonel Briggs." He stopped. He turned back. Evelyn looked at him with an expression that was perfectly calm and contained something underneath the calm that made two of the MPs shift their weight without entirely understanding why. "The worst mistake you ever made," she said quietly, "was not sending me away. It was forgetting who I am." Briggs looked at her for a moment. Then he almost smiled. "Take her to the gate." The MPs moved to escort her, and she walked with them, and she did not look back at her team, because if she had looked back, she would have seen Marcus Webb's face, and Marcus Webb's face in that moment would have made everything harder to carry. She had enough to carry already. She picked up her badge from the hand of the MP who had retrieved it, clipped it to nothing because there was nothing to clip it to anymore. And she walked toward the gate of the installation she had served for 4 years as if she were simply leaving for the evening. Nobody on that tarmac understood what she had meant. Nobody except Evelyn. The roadside motel was called the Pinewood Rest, and it was the kind of place that had stopped trying to become something better sometime around 1987. The carpet had a pattern that might have once been geometric and was now simply irregular. The air conditioning unit in the window made a sound like a truck slowly running out of oil. The mattress had the structural integrity of a strong opinion held by a weak person. Evelyn Carter sat on the edge of it and did not panic. This was the thing about Evelyn that people who did not know her often misread. They assumed that because she was calm in crisis, she was not affected by crisis. They assumed that the absence of visible distress meant the absence of distress entirely. This was wrong. She felt everything. She was feeling it right now. The humiliation of the tarmac. The specific weight of watching Marcus Webb stand down when every instinct he had was telling him to step forward. The physical reality of a shoulder wound that needed proper attention. The low, steady burn of 12 years of service being dropped on a concrete surface like it was something disposable. She felt all of it. And then she set it aside the way she had learned to set things aside, and she opened the emergency bag she had carried off that transport under her arm, because she always carried her emergency bag, and the MPs had not thought to take it. And she pulled out the encrypted laptop that she had carried in that bag for 6 years and had used in 3 countries and had never once discussed with anyone in her chain of command because it was not a military asset. It was hers. She opened it, connected to the motel's Wi-Fi through a VPN layer that would have made the base's cybersecurity team deeply interested if they had known it existed, and she composed a single message to a single recipient. "Thomas, we need to talk. It is time." She sent it at 06:23 hours. At 06:31, her phone rang. Thomas Reed had the voice of a man who had spent his entire career in rooms where people were trying to convince other people of things and had developed the particular quality of sounding unhurried even when the situation was urgent. He was 61 years old, the CEO of Reed Carter Defense Systems, a company with $17 billion in annual government contracts, 7,000 employees, and a board of directors that had spent 15 years being quietly confused about why the woman whose name was on the company's operational legacy never showed up to annual shareholder meetings. Evelyn. Not a question, not a greeting exactly, more like an acknowledgement that things had moved. They relieved me of Command Thomas, stripped my credentials, banned me from the installation. A pause. The mission. Successful. Every operator home. I took a fragment wound. 2 of my people needed surgery. We made it back. Another pause longer this time. Briggs? Yes. I've been watching his file for 2 years. What do you need? This was the thing about Thomas Reed that Evelyn valued above everything else. He did not perform sympathy. He did not waste time on outrage that served no tactical purpose. He identified the operational question and asked it directly. It was the quality that had made him excellent at running a company that required precision and speed. And it was the quality that had made him 12 years ago the only person who had genuinely understood why Evelyn had walked away from everything. She had been 26 years old when she left. The Reed Carter Empire was not simply a company. It was a legacy built by her grandfather, expanded by her father, handed to the generation that was supposed to continue it. There were board seats and equity structures and succession arrangements that had been planned before Evelyn was old enough to understand what they meant. And at 26, having watched the military service of people she admired more deeply than she had ever admired any executive, she had made a decision that her father had never entirely forgiven and that Thomas Reed had never entirely understood but had respected. She had joined the Navy. She had never told anyone in uniform about what she had left behind, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she believed with that kind of conviction, the kind of conviction that does not bend, that you cannot lead people who are willing to die for something if they suspect you might be doing it for reasons other than belief. She was not a billionaire playing at service. She was a commander who happened to still hold significant equity in a defense company, kept in a trust structure that required almost no active management and attracted almost no attention. Almost. I need you to look at something specific, she told Thomas. The airspace around Camp Macall, the training corridors. I want to know who holds the long-term operational contracts on those zones. She could hear him typing. Thomas was old enough to remember when research meant phone calls and young enough to have become genuinely expert at finding information that other people had assumed was buried. Give me 20 minutes, he said. It took him 14. Evelyn. His voice had changed. The unhurried quality was still there, but underneath it was something that sounded like the controlled version of disbelief. The primary airspace management contract for the Camp Macall training corridors. The long-term DO delay lease agreement covering the restricted aviation zones in that entire sector of North Carolina. Yes. It runs through Reed Carter, has for 11 years, renewed twice. Current term expires in 4 years. The room was very quiet. So when Briggs banned me from the installation, Evelyn said slowly, he banned me from an installation whose primary training airspace is operationally managed through a contract with a company I own significant equity in. You own 23% of Reed Carter, Evelyn. Your grandfather's trust structure never changed. You never sold. You never divested. You never had to because no one in your military career ever had reason to look. Until now. Until now. Thomas paused. Briggs doesn't know. No, she said, he doesn't. She stood up from the edge of the bed and walked to the window, and she looked at the parking lot of the Pinewood Rest Motel, and she thought about a man who had picked up her identification badge from a concrete surface and handed it to someone who had thrown it there, and she thought about Marcus Webb standing down, and she thought about the words Briggs had said loud enough for an entire tarmac to hear. No longer your responsibility. Thomas, she said, I need you to pull the classified communication logs from the operational period. Specifically, I need the traffic from the emergency evacuation request I filed at hour 14 of the mission. He was quiet for a moment. That requires a cleared contractor with active OD, access. You have 6 of them on your payroll. I do. A pause. Evelyn, what are you expecting to find? She thought about the moment 14 hours into the firefight in a building that was becoming progressively less structurally reliable, when she had made the call for emergency evacuation and received after a silence that lasted longer than any silence should last. In that context, a response that had not been a response but a deflection, a bureaucratic non-answer. And then 18 minutes later, a flat denial. From someone with the authority to deny it. From someone who would have had to make a deliberate choice to let that request sit on his desk for 18 minutes before refusing it. I'm expecting to find, she said carefully, that Richard Briggs was aware that American operators were at serious risk of dying and made a deliberate decision to deny their evacuation, and then spent the days after our return constructing a paper case against me that would explain why I never came back to tell anyone about it. The silence on the other end of the line was the silence of a man putting several things together at the same time. That's not a career matter, Thomas said quietly. No, she agreed. It stopped being a career matter the moment he said our possible deaths were an acceptable loss. She paused. He said that Thomas, on a recorded channel, he said the loss of an elite special operations element was acceptable. Another silence. How long do you need, she asked. 3 days, he said, maybe less. I'll be here, she said, and looked around the room that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and 30 years of other people's quiet emergencies, and almost smiled. I'm not going anywhere. But even as she said it, she knew that was not precisely true. Because Evelyn Carter had spent 12 years learning that the most effective thing you can do in any situation where someone has underestimated you is not to argue with them about it. The most effective thing you can do is wait until the moment when the full weight of exactly how badly they misjudged you lands on them all at once. Briggs had called her a protocol violation. He had thrown her credentials on a concrete surface. He had stood in front of her wounded team and pronounced them no longer her responsibility. He had no idea who she was, and she had told him quietly in front of everyone that the worst mistake he ever made was not sending her away. It was forgetting who she was. In the Pinewood Rest Motel in room 112, Evelyn Carter opened a second encrypted channel, began composing the preliminary framework for what she was already thinking of, not as a complaint or an appeal, but as an operation. And she did not feel the fragment wound in her shoulder, or the exhaustion of 17 days in a combat zone, or the particular specific ache of being stripped of something she had earned. She felt instead something that people who had worked with her for years had learned to recognize and quietly feared. She felt focused. 3 days, Thomas had said. 3 days was more than enough. Outside, the Carolina morning was coming up gold and warm through the motel's thin curtains, and somewhere across the county, Camp McCall was going about its business, and Colonel Richard Briggs was almost certainly sitting behind his desk, feeling the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has solved a problem. He had not solved a problem. He had created one, and it was already in motion. Marcus Webb had not slept. He had gone through the post-mission medical process, had his arm properly assessed, had sat through a preliminary debrief that he had answered with the bare minimum required by regulation, and then he had gone to his quarters and sat on his bunk and stared at the wall. Diana Okafor had come by at some point. She had not said anything for a while, which was one of the things Marcus appreciated most about Diana, her understanding that some silences are not empty and do not need to be filled. She knew something, Diana said finally. She always knows something, Marcus said. No, Diana shook her head slowly. This was different. Did you see her face when she said that to him, about the worst mistake not being sending her away? Marcus had seen her face. He had been watching her face for 4 years because when you operate under someone's command, in conditions where the wrong decision means someone goes home in a flag-covered box, you learn to read that person's face the way you read terrain. You learn which expressions mean immediate danger and which mean managed risk, and which mean something is happening that you don't have full visibility on, but that is being handled. Her face on the tarmac when she said those words to Briggs had been the last one. Something is being handled. She walked away from something big, Marcus said. Before the Navy, I've always thought that. The way she talks about resource allocation, the way she thinks about contractor relationships, the way she never not once seemed surprised when logistics came through faster than it should have. Diana considered this. You think she has connections? I think, Marcus said carefully, that Briggs made a mistake that is a lot bigger than he realizes, and I think she is going to let him figure that out on his own schedule. Diana was quiet for a moment. What do we do? We wait, Marcus said. We follow regulations. We don't contact her through unofficial channels because Briggs will be watching for that, and we don't give him any additional ammunition. He paused. And we trust her. You trust her, Ducana said, not a challenge, an observation. Completely, Marcus said. He meant it. In 4 years of operating under Evelyn Carter's command, through 2 deployments and 1 situation that was never officially classified as a deployment, but had definitely been a deployment in every sense that mattered, Marcus Webb had learned the specific texture of what genuine command competence felt like from the inside. He had served under commanders who were brave and commanders who were smart and commanders who were technically proficient. He had served under one commander who was all 3, and he had watched that commander walk off a military tarmac with her credentials taken and her authority stripped, and he had watched her face and he had seen underneath the controlled calm, not defeat. Not even close to defeat. Something that looked, if he was being honest with himself, a great deal like the early stages of something arriving. He did not know what it was, but he had learned over 4 years to trust it, and so he waited. Thomas Reed called back at exactly the 47-minute mark, and Evelyn knew from the first syllable that he had found something worse than what she had expected. I need you to listen carefully, he said, and I need you to not react until I finish. Go ahead. I pulled the communication logs from the operational window. Full traffic hour 0 through hour 22. My cleared contractor accessed the archived relay through the DoD Joint Communications Database. Everything is timestamped, everything is authenticated, and everything is on record. He paused. Evelyn, the evacuation request you filed at hour 14, it did not sit on Briggs's desk for 18 minutes because of administrative delay. She waited. It sat there because he opened it, read it, flagged it as non-priority, and went back to a separate communication thread he was running with someone at the Pentagon Logistics Office about a completely unrelated training budget matter. For 18 minutes while your team was taking fire in a building that was being systematically destroyed around you, Richard Briggs was arguing about funding allocations for a ground vehicle maintenance program. The room was very still. Then he denied the request, Thomas continued. But that is not the part that is going to matter most, Darren. The part that is going to matter most is what he said on the secondary channel, the one he was running parallel to the official operational frequency 30 seconds after he filed the denial. He sent a text-based communication to a contact listed only as R7 in his log, and what he wrote was 11 words. Thomas stopped. She could hear him breathing. He wrote request denied. If she loses people out there, problem solves itself. Evelyn sat very still on the edge of the bed in room 112 of the Pinewood Rest Motel, and she did not speak for a long time. He wanted you to lose operators, Thomas said quietly. He calculated that if you came back with casualties, anything you said afterward could be attributed to a commander deflecting blame for a failed mission. He was building his case against you from inside the operational window while the operation was still running. He built his case, Evelyn said slowly, by hoping my people would die. Yes, another silence. Thomas? Her voice had not changed in temperature or volume. This was the thing that people who worked closely with her had learned to notice and take seriously. When Evelyn Carter got very quiet and very still, it was not because she was absorbing a blow. It was because she was making a decision. What is the evidentiary status of those logs? Authenticated, time-stamped. Stored in the DoD Joint Archive, which means chain of custody is already established. My contractor did not alter or extract anything. He documented access through the official cleared contractor portal. If someone subpoenas those records, they are already in a condition to be admissible. And the R7 contact, working on it, cross-referencing Briggs's known communication network against Pentagon personnel codes. I should have an identification within 24 hours. Good. She stood. She walked to the window again. What about the airspace contracts? How quickly can Reed Carter assert operational authority in the Camp McCall training corridors if the situation requires it? Thomas was quiet for a moment. You're thinking about something larger than a legal complaint. I am thinking about accountability, she said. Real accountability, not a formal report that gets filed and reviewed over 8 months and results in a letter of reprimand that goes into a jacket and changes nothing. I am thinking about the kind of accountability that every operator who has ever trusted a commander and been abandoned by one deserves. The kind where there is no ambiguity and no room for revision and no way for anyone to look away and pretend they didn't hear it. Thomas was quiet for 3 seconds. How many aircraft does Reed Carter have access to through the Joint Defense Aviation Program, she asked. Directly 11, through partnership agreements with 3 other contractors and 2 National Guard aviation units that operate under DoD coordination agreements we manage. A pause. Considerably more. I need you to make some calls, she said. Not yet, but I need you to begin laying the groundwork. Evelyn, his voice was careful. What are you planning? I am planning, she said, to make sure that Richard Briggs never has the opportunity to do to another operator what he attempted to do to my team. And I am planning to do it in a way that every person who was on that tarmac when he threw my credentials on the ground gets to witness. The silence on the other end of the line was different from the earlier silences. This one had a quality of someone standing at the edge of something significant and deciding whether to step forward. I'll make the calls, Thomas said. She ended the call and stood at the window for a while longer, and she thought about Marcus Webb's face when she had told him to stand down, and the particular look in his eyes that was not compliance but trust, the specific, expensive kind of trust that people pay for with time and risk, and the accumulation of moments where someone proved they were worth it. She thought about Diana Okafor walking off that transport with cracked ribs chin up, because that was who Diana was. She thought about each member of her team by name, the way she always did when the weight of command got heavy, because names were the antidote to abstraction. Names were what turned a tactical element into 12 specific human beings who had given her something that could not be manufactured or demanded. They had given her their trust, and Briggs had looked at that trust and called it an acceptable loss. She was not going to let that stand, not for a day, not for an hour longer than it took to dismantle it completely. She opened the laptop again and began to work. Across the county camp, MACAW was running its normal morning operations, and in the base legal office, a captain named Holloway was reviewing the file that Briggs had prepared on Evelyn Carter. And the more he read it, the more uncomfortable he felt, because he was good at his job, and his job required him to assess evidentiary weight, and the evidentiary weight of what Briggs had assembled was thin in the specific way that cases assembled backward from a conclusion tend to be thin. You build a case forward from evidence. You do not build evidence backward from a desired outcome. Holloway had been in military law long enough to know the difference, and what he was reading felt like the second kind. He flagged 3 items in the file that he thought required additional support before the case could proceed. He sent the flag to Briggs's office. He did not receive a response that day. He told himself this was normal processing delay and tried to believe it. He mostly succeeded. Meanwhile, in the officers' quarters on the eastern side of the installation, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb had gotten approximately 3 hours of something that resembled sleep and had woken up with the same thought he had fallen asleep with, which was that Evelyn Carter had looked at Richard Briggs and said something that was not a threat and not a plea, but something else entirely, something he kept turning over in his mind like a stone with an interesting weight. The worst mistake you ever made was not sending me away. It was forgetting who I am. He had known her for 4 years. He had operated under her command in conditions that reduced people to their absolute fundamentals, that stripped away everything that was performed or borrowed or constructed and left only what was genuinely there. And what was genuinely there in Evelyn Carter was something he had never entirely been able to categorize. Not simply courage, because courage was common enough in their world. Not simply intelligence, because intelligence alone did not explain the specific quality of her decisions under pressure. It was something more like a combination of roots and reach, the kind of person who is deeply planted and can therefore extend further than anyone realizes without losing stability. He had always known she had come from somewhere significant. She never said so. She never referenced family or background or money in the casual way that people who have money sometimes do without noticing. But there were moments, small ones, where something showed through. The way she spoke about resource structures, the way she never seemed surprised when support came from unexpected directions, the way she talked about institutional relationships as if she understood from the inside how they actually worked rather than how they were presented as working. He had filed all of these observations away over 4 years and had not assembled them into anything conclusive because it was not his place to, and because it had never mattered before. It was starting to feel like it might matter now. Diana knocked on his door at 0900. Legal sent Briggs a flag, she said, stepping inside. 3 items in the case file require additional evidentiary support. My source in the JAG office said Holloway is not comfortable with how thin the documentation is. Marcus looked at her. How do you have a source in the JAG office? I have a source everywhere, Diana said without any particular emphasis, as if this were simply a fact about the world. The point is that Briggs's case against her is not as solid as he thinks it is. If she pushes back through official channels, she's not going to push back through official channels, Marcus said. Diana stopped. How do you know? Because she said it was not about saving her career. He paused. She said that on the tarmac before they walked her to the gate. She said it quietly to Webb, not to Briggs, not for anyone else to hear. She said, this is bigger than the career now. I was close enough to hear it, and I don't think she meant for me to. Diana sat down slowly. Bigger than the career. Whatever she's doing, Marcus said, it is not an appeal. It is not a grievance filing. It is not a complaint to the Inspector General. He looked at Diana steadily. It is something else. They sat on it for a moment. We follow regulations, Marcus said finally. We do not contact her unofficially. We do not do anything that gives Briggs additional material. We do our jobs. He paused. And we wait. You keep saying that because it keeps being true. Thomas Reed's people worked through the night, and by the following morning, they had identified R7. His name was Deputy Director Lawrence Crane, a senior administrator in the Pentagon's Operational Oversight Division, a man with 22 years of bureaucratic tenure and a relationship with Briggs that dated back to a joint training program in 2009. He was not a combat officer. He had never been a combat officer. He was the kind of man who accumulated institutional power through patience and proximity, who understood that the architecture of authority in large organizations is maintained not by the people at the top, but by the people who control information flow between levels, and who had spent 2 decades becoming quietly indispensable in ways that were difficult to audit. He was also Thomas's financial analyst, had discovered by the second morning the silent administrative sponsor of a pending proposal that would have restructured the oversight framework for Special Operations Command accountability, a proposal that, if adopted, would have significantly reduced the authority of field commanders and concentrated review power in the hands of administrators like Crane himself. An elite special operations team suffering casualties on a mission commanded by a female officer with a reputation for bypassing administrative processes would have been for Crane's proposal an extremely convenient data point. Evelyn read the analysis report at 7:14 on the second morning, sitting on the edge of the Pinewood Rest Motel bed with a cup of coffee she had made with the in-room machine, which produced something that was technically coffee in the same way that a bicycle is technically a vehicle. She read it twice. She set it down on the mattress beside her. Then she called Thomas. Crane, she said when he answered. Yes. He co-authored the restructuring proposal. Filed it 6 months ago. It's been sitting in committee. 3 of the 4 committee members are career military. 1 is a political appointee who owes Crane a professional debt. Thomas paused. If your mission had gone badly, Crane would have had his data point. Briggs would have had his justification. The proposal would have cleared committee inside 90 days. And Special Operations Command accountability, Evelyn said slowly, would have been restructured to give administrative officers like Crane review authority over field decisions. Field decisions including emergency evacuation approvals. So Crane would have been able to do what Briggs did, she said, but with institutional cover. Systemically, repeatedly, across every special operations element operating under DOD jurisdiction. Thomas's voice was very quiet. Evelyn, this is not about Briggs. Briggs is a symptom. This is about a systematic attempt to transfer command accountability away from operators and toward administrators who have never been into the field. She stood up. She walked to the window. The parking lot of the Pinewood Rest Motel looked exactly as it had every other time she had looked at it, which was to say it looked like a parking lot, ordinary and indifferent, and she stood in front of it feeling the specific weight of understanding a problem that is larger than you initially thought, which is a weight with a particular texture, simultaneously heavier and somehow clarifying. Thomas, she said, the aircraft framework. How far along are you? Further than you asked me to go, he said. I anticipated where this was heading. How many? A pause. If we activate the full partnership network, including the National Guard aviation units operating under our DDBI coordination agreements, and if we obtain authorization from a senior enough military official to operate through the Joint Emergency Defense Framework. He paused again. 40. She was quiet. 40 aircraft, he said. Apache gunships through the Guard partnership, Blackhawks through the Joint Logistics Agreement, Special Operations transports through our primary DoD contract, escort platforms through the Reed-Carter Direct Aviation Program. Another pause. Every aircraft would carry valid Department of Defense authorization. Every flight plan would be filed through legitimate channels. Every crew would be operating within their authorized parameters. And the formation would be within our contractual rights to route through the Camp McCall training corridors. She said, because Reed-Carter holds the operational management contract on those airspace zones, the formation would be operating entirely within parameters we are legally and contractually authorized to establish, Thomas confirmed. Evelyn looked at the parking lot. I need one more thing, she said, the senior military official. It has to be someone who has the authority to make what happens next carry institutional weight, not just optics, real weight. I've been thinking about that, Thomas said. General Wallace Dean. She knew the name. Everybody in Special Operations knew the name. General Wallace Dean was 4 stars United States Special Operations Command, 34 years of service, 2 combat tours as a field commander before anyone had heard of him, and the reputation which was not simply reputation, but documented reality of being the kind of senior officer who had never once allowed administrative convenience to override the welfare of the operators under his command. He had testified before Congress 3 times on behalf of Special Operations personnel who had been failed by the system. He had never lost. You know Dean, she asked. I've done business with SOCOM for 11 years, Thomas said. I know Dean well enough to make a phone call. What he does with the information is his decision. Send him the logs, she said. The evacuation request, the 18-minute delay, the denial, and the R7 communication. All of it authenticated with chain of custody documentation. And send him the analysis on Crane's restructuring proposal and its relationship to this operation. And if he wants to speak with you directly, give him my number, she said. I'll be here. She ended the call and sat back down on the edge of the bed and held the coffee cup in both hands and thought about Briggs standing on that tarmac with the absolute confidence of a man who believes he has arranged everything to his advantage. She thought about Crane and his Pentagon office patient and institutional building, a framework designed to protect people like Briggs from accountability. She thought about every operator who had ever made an emergency call and heard silence on the other end of the line, and she thought about the ones who had not come back because that silence lasted too long. Her shoulder ached. She had changed the dressing herself the night before using the medical supplies in her emergency bag, and the wound was clean, not infected, healing on a normal schedule, but it reminded her with every movement that it was there. Good, she thought. It was supposed to remind her. General Dean called at 1347 on the second afternoon. He did not begin with pleasantries. Lieutenant Commander Carter. His voice was the voice of a man who had given orders in situations where the orders mattered in a very final way. I've reviewed everything Reed sent me. All of it. Yes, sir. I want to ask you one question before I say anything else. Did you at any point during that operation make a decision that you believe compromised the safety of your team in a way that was not operationally justified? No, sir. The 3 deviations from approved parameters that Briggs listed in his file. First deviation, I redirected our extraction vehicle 15 degrees off the approved route because I had real-time intelligence indicating the approved route had been compromised. That decision is documented in my mission log with timestamp and intelligence sourcing. Second deviation, I authorized a civilian asset to provide logistical support during the resupply phase because our approved supply chain had a failure at the forward position. That decision is also documented. Third deviation, I extended our operational timeline by 4 hours because 2 of my operators were not ambulatory and I was not going to leave them in a position where they could not move under their own power. That decision required no documentation because field commanders have explicit authority understanding operational orders to extend timelines when personnel are at risk. A pause. All three deviations, Dean said, represent exactly the kind of field judgment that Special Operations Command Authority exists to protect. Yes, sir. Briggs is not a Special Operations Commander, Dean said. He is an installation administrator who has been given oversight authority he does not have the background to exercise responsibly. Another pause longer. The R7 communication. Yes, sir. If she loses people out there, problem solves itself. He said it flatly, the way you say something that requires no additional weight because it carries its own. He wrote that. The documentation is authenticated, sir. Chain of custody is clean. I know, I had my own people verify it independently before I called you. A silence. Lieutenant Commander Carter, Thomas Reed outlined a proposed course of action to me, a formation, a return. Yes, sir. I want to be clear about what I am willing to authorize and why. I am not doing this as a gesture. I am not doing this for theater. I am doing this because Richard Briggs endangered American operators through deliberate negligence because he collaborated with a Pentagon administrator to structure that negligence in a way that would serve a political agenda, and because the only way to ensure that what he did cannot be quietly managed into a file and forgotten is to make it impossible for anyone present to claim they were not fully aware of what happened. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. Do you understand what I am authorizing? I understand, sir. I will be on the lead aircraft, he said. My staff will coordinate with the Reed's people on the formation logistics. We will file everything through proper channels. Every authorization will be legitimate. Every aircraft will be operating within its approved parameters. A pause. And every soldier on that installation is going to hear those recordings. Evelyn did not say anything for a moment. Sir, her voice was steady. Thank you. Don't thank me, Dean said. Just be ready. We move in 48 hours. She ended the call and set the phone down on the mattress and sat very still for a long time, not thinking about the formation or the aircraft or the recordings or the 48 hours, thinking instead about a morning 17 days ago when she had walked her team onto a transport and they had trusted her with their lives in the specific way that only people who have proven the worth of that trust over time can earn, and how she had carried that trust across 8,000 miles and through 3 firefights in 18 minutes of silence on an emergency channel, and how she had brought every single one of them home. She had promised them nothing because commanders who promise outcomes are lying. She had given them everything because commanders who hold back are failing. Now she was going to finish it. Outside the thin curtains of room 112, the Carolina afternoon was running toward evening, and somewhere across the county, Richard Briggs was sitting behind his desk, feeling like a man who has solved a problem. And somewhere in a Pentagon office, Lawrence Crane was moving his restructuring proposal through its quiet channels, and neither of them had any idea that 48 hours from now, the sky above Camp Macaw was going to fill with something they had not planned for and could not stop. Not a complaint, not an appeal, not a grievance filed through channels designed to contain and delay and ultimately dissolve accountability into procedure. Something that would land in front of every soldier on that installation and make it impossible for anyone ever to say they did not know what Richard Briggs had done and why it could never be allowed to stand. Evelyn Carter lay back on the mattress of the Pinewood Rest Motel, stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in 3 days closed her eyes without the weight pressing down on her chest. 48 hours. She would sleep now. She had earned it. The 48 hours did not pass slowly. They passed the way time passes when something enormous is being assembled just outside your field of vision, which is to say they passed with a kind of compressed urgency that made each hour feel both shorter and heavier than normal. Evelyn slept for 6 hours on the second night, woke before dawn, ate something from the vending machine at the end of the corridor that was technically food, and spent the remaining time on the phone and the laptop, coordinating, confirming, and doing the thing she had always been best at, which was making sure that when the moment arrived, every component was exactly where it needed to be. Thomas called at 600 on the morning of the 3rd day. Formation is confirmed, he said. 40 aircraft, all authorizations filed, all flight plans logged through the legitimate DoD coordination channels. The Camp Macall Tower will receive standard advance notification through the Airspace Management System, which, as you know, routes through our operational contract. A pause. They will see it coming on radar approximately 12 minutes before arrival. They will have no authority to redirect or deny because every aircraft in the formation has valid clearance through channels that predate Briggs's tenure on that installation by 7 years. General Dean wheels up from his staging location at 0800. He will be on the lead Black Hawk. He asked me to tell you to be ready at the designated landing zone by 0900 and that he does not want to wait. He won't wait, she said. I know, Thomas said. I told him that. She ended the call and sat for a moment in the room that had been her operational base for 3 days, and she looked at the thin curtains and the industrial carpet and the air conditioning unit that sounded like a truck slowly dying. And she felt something that was not quite sentiment, but was close to it, the specific quality of having done something important in an undignified place, which is its own kind of proof that the work matters more than the setting. Then she stood, picked up her emergency bag, and walked out of room 112 of the Pinewood Rest Motel without looking back. The morning was clear. The Carolina sky had the particular quality of early autumn clarity, the kind of air that makes distances feel honest, where you can look at something far away and trust that what you are seeing is actually there. She stood in the parking lot and breathed it in, and her shoulder reminded her it existed, and she told it she was aware, and she walked to the rental vehicle that Thomas's people had arranged the previous afternoon and drove toward the designated coordinate. Across the county, Camp Macall was beginning its normal operational day. In the radar operations room, Specialist Kevin Darrow was running the standard morning frequency check when the first anomaly appeared on his scope at 0848. He looked at it, blinked, looked again, and then leaned forward in the way that radar operators lean forward when they are seeing something that does not fit any category they have been trained to expect. It was not one aircraft. It was not a small formation. It was a wall of returns moving in coordinated alignment from the northwest, and as he began running identification queries on each transponder code, the responses came back one after another, all valid, all authorized, all carrying OD clearance codes that the system recognized without question. He ran the query a second time because he needed to. The system confirmed everything a second time. He picked up the radio. "Oh, tower, this is radar. I have an inbound formation I need you to take a look at." The tower controller, a sergeant named Pratt who had worked Camp Macall approach for 3 years and had seen most things, leaned over the scope and looked at what Darrow was showing him, and the specific expression that crossed his face was one that people who knew him would not have recognized because it was an expression he had never made before. "How many?" Pratt asked. Darrow had been counting. "I'm getting 40 discrete transponder returns, all valid, all authorized." He paused. "Sergeant, they are routing through the primary training corridor." "The primary corridor is managed through the Reed-Carter contract, I know. I checked. Every clearance in this formation is routed through that contract framework." Darrow looked up from the scope. "Sergeant, we don't have authority to redirect them. Everything they are doing is inside their authorized parameters." Pratt stared at the scope for another 3 seconds. Then he reached for the base-wide communication channel. "Tower to base operations. We have an unscheduled formation inbound on the primary corridor. 40 aircraft, all authorized. ETA approximately 9 minutes. The response from base operations took 4 seconds longer than it should have. Say again, tower. 40 aircraft. Confirmed 40 valid DOD clearance. We have no authority to redirect." Another silence. Then base operations to all units. Unscheduled formation inbound. All personnel maintain current positions. But that was not what happened. What happened was the opposite of that because word moves through a military installation at a speed that no official communication channel can match. And within 90 seconds of the base operations announcement, soldiers were moving toward open ground with the particular momentum of people who have heard something that their instincts tell them they need to see. Not because they were ordered to, because something in the announcement, the number 40, the word unscheduled, the specific careful neutrality of the tower controller's voice communicated that this was not a routine event and that people who were not present for it would regret the absence. Marcus Webb heard it from Diana Okafor, who had heard it from her source in base operations, who had used 2 words that he said in a voice Marcus had never heard him use before, which was a voice that had lost its professional composure entirely and was operating on something rawer and more instinctive. 2 words, she's back. Marcus was out of his quarters and moving before Diana finished the sentence. In his office, Colonel Richard Briggs received the tower notification through his aide, a young captain named Foster, who delivered information with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned that the messenger's survival depended on not appearing to have any opinion about the message. Foster read the tower report, and something in his voice when he said the words 40 aircraft, all authorized, changed the temperature in the room in a way that Briggs noticed and did not like. "What do you mean all authorized?" Briggs said. "The formation has valid DoD clearance on every aircraft, sir, all 40. The clearances are routed through the Reed-Carter Airspace Management contract." Briggs stood up. "Reed-Carter manages the training corridor contracts. That's a standard logistics arrangement. It doesn't give a civilian contractor the authority to run a formation of military aircraft through this installation's approach zone without my approval." Foster hesitated. "Sir, the JAG officer on duty reviewed the contract framework when the tower flag came through. The Reed-Carter contract grants operational management authority over the primary training corridors, which includes authority to authorize formations operating within those corridors, subject to valid DoD clearance on each aircraft. Every aircraft in this formation has that clearance." "Who authorized the DoD clearances?" Foster hesitated again, longer this time. "Foster." Briggs's voice had an edge in it. "Who authorized the clearances?" "They were authorized through the SOCOM Joint Emergency Defense Framework, sir. The authorizing signature belongs to General Wallace Dean." The room went very quiet. Briggs knew the name. Everybody knew the name. You did not spend 20 years in the military without knowing who Wallace Dean was and what Wallace Dean represented in the institutional hierarchy of Special Operations Command. You did not confuse Wallace Dean with the kind of senior officer whose involvement in a situation could be managed or redirected or waited out. General Dean is on this formation. Briggs's voice was carefully controlled. "He is listed as the senior officer on the lead aircraft, sir." Briggs sat back down slowly. Something was happening. He could feel it the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. Not the storm itself, but the air changing around you in ways that mean the storm is coming and is larger than you prepared for. He had built a clean case against Carter. He had the protocol violations documented, the chain of command deviations cataloged, the legal office review initiated. He had done everything correctly, or rather, he had done everything in the way that looked correct from the outside, and he had spent 3 days feeling the specific confidence of a man who believes he has already won. But 40 aircraft, with General Wallace Dean on the lead bird, routing through a contractor framework that he had apparently never examined closely enough. "Sir," Foster's voice was very careful, "the formation's ETA is approximately 4 minutes. Briggs stood. "Get the MPs to the primary landing zone. I want a reception detail ready." "Sir, do you want to contact General Dean's office?" "To MPs," Briggs said. "Landing zone, 4 minutes." Foster left. Briggs straightened his uniform. He told himself this was still manageable. Whatever Carter had arranged, whatever she had convinced Dean of, whatever was coming down from the northwest in a formation of 40 aircraft, he was the base commander. This was his installation. He had authority here, and authority was the thing that mattered, the thing that had always mattered, the thing that separated people like him from people like Carter, who had talent but not the institutional standing to make it mean anything permanent. He was still telling himself this when the sound arrived. It arrived before the aircraft were visible, which is the nature of 40 aircraft in tight formation. The sound outruns the image, and it filled the air over Camp McCall with something that every soldier who heard it would remember for the rest of their careers. Not because the sound itself was unusual. They had all heard helicopters, Apache gunships, Black Hawks, special operations, transports, all of that was familiar. What was not familiar was the scale of it. The layered density of 40 sets of rotors operating in coordinated sequence. A sound that was not loud so much as total, a sound that occupied all available space and left no room for anything else. Soldiers stopped walking. Soldiers who had been heading somewhere with purpose stopped and turned. Soldiers who had received the instruction to maintain current positions had ignored it without quite realizing they were ignoring it and were now standing in open ground looking northwest. Marcus Webb was among them. He stood next to Diana Okafor, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the sound was not already saying more completely. 40, Diana said finally very quietly. 40, Marcus confirmed. He had known. He had told her to wait, to trust, to follow regulations, and let it unfold. He had said it with confidence because he believed it, because 4 years of operating under Evelyn Carter's command had given him a specific education in what her calm meant, and what her focus meant, and what her particular brand of stillness in the face of institutional pressure meant. He had known something was coming. He had not known it would be this. Nobody had known it would be this. The first aircraft came over the installation boundary, and then the second, and then they were coming in a formation that spread across the sky in a way that made the sky feel smaller. Apache gunships in the outer positions, with their angular, aggressive profiles that looked designed by someone who had decided that a helicopter should communicate threat as a primary function. Blackhawks in the transport positions, special operations aircraft with their additional equipment and modified configurations that marked them as something beyond standard military aviation escort platforms at altitude, providing the kind of overwatch that you deploy when the situation warrants it. The Camp McCall Tower could only broadcast one thing. Pratt's voice came over the base speaker system, and it was the voice of a man who was maintaining professionalism through the specific effort of will that very unusual situations require. And what he said was simple and accurate, and somehow in the moment carried the weight of something much larger than the words themselves. Tower to base. The civilian is returning. The phrase went through Camp McCall like something electrical. The civilian. Not an officer, not a commander, not a lieutenant commander. The civilian. Because that was what Briggs had made her when he stripped her credentials and walked her to the gate. He had made her a civilian. And now the civilian was returning with 40 aircraft and a 4-star general and authorizations routed through a contract that bore her name and had been bearing it for 11 years while nobody thought to look. Briggs reached the landing zone with his MP detail and stood watching the formation descend, and his face was doing something that Foster, standing 2 steps behind him, had never seen it do before. It was the face of a man whose certainty is leaving him in real time, not all at once, but in the specific incremental way that certainty leaves when the situation keeps producing information that the certainty had not accounted for. The lead Blackhawk touched down. The rotor wash pushed it at the uniforms of everyone standing within range, and then the door opened, and the first person who stepped out was not Evelyn Carter. It was a man in civilian executive dress carrying a briefcase that had the angular precision of something that contained documents rather than personal effects. Behind him came 2 more people in civilian clothes, both carrying document cases, both moving with the focused efficiency of people who know exactly what they are there to do. Behind them came 3 men in uniform, decorated in the specific way that special operations veterans are decorated, which is to say heavily and without any apparent concern for elegance. The ribbons and citations and unit commendations of careers spent in places that required real proof. And then General Wallace Dean stepped out of the Blackhawk. He was 60 years old and looked like someone who had spent 34 of those years in situations where looking weak was operationally dangerous. He was not physically imposing in the Hollywood sense, not tall, not constructed like a recruitment poster. He was imposing in the way that genuine authority is imposing, which is not about size, but about the specific quality of attention he gave to everything around him. The attention of a man who does not miss things and does not need to be told twice. He looked at the formation of MPS that Briggs had arranged. He looked at Briggs. He did not speak yet. And then the second aircraft touched down and Evelyn Carter stepped out. She was wearing civilian clothes, not a uniform, because she had no uniform to wear. Briggs had seen to that, but she wore them the way she wore everything, which was with the specific quality of someone for whom the clothing is entirely irrelevant, because the authority they carry is not located in what they are wearing. She had her emergency bag over one shoulder. Her left shoulder, where the fragment wound was still healing, was held with the slight, careful quality that comes from managing pain without advertising it. Her face was calm, not the performed calm of someone suppressing reaction, the actual calm of someone who has done the work and knows where they are. She looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at her. Around them, thousands of soldiers watched. Briggs made a decision. He made it because it was the only thing left in his tactical inventory, which was the inventory of a man who had spent 3 days believing he held all the relevant cards and was only now beginning to understand that he had been playing with an incomplete deck. He stepped forward with the posture of a base commander asserting installation authority, and his voice carried the weight of his rank and his position in his 2 years of running this installation. Lieutenant Commander Carter, you are banned from this installation. Whatever authorization you believe you have obtained does not supersede base command authority. MPs take her into custody. Not one MP moved. Briggs turned to look at them. The MP, Sergeant, a man named Kowalski, who had been in the military police for 11 years and had a face that was not expressive by professional habit, was looking at General Dean with the expression of someone who has just done a very rapid calculation and arrived at a very clear answer. MP. Briggs's voice had an edge that was trying to be authority and was becoming something else. That is a direct order. General Dean stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He had learned a long time ago that the people who need to raise their voices to be heard have already lost something fundamental. Colonel Briggs, he stopped at a distance that was close enough to be personal and far enough to be deliberate. You will stand down. The words were quiet. They landed like something dropped from a significant height. Sir, with respect, this is my installation and, Colonel, Dean's voice did not change. You will stand down. That is not a request. That is not a discussion. That is an order from a flag officer who outranks you by 3 grades and who has in the last 48 hours reviewed authenticated documentation that makes your continued exercise of command authority on this installation not only inappropriate, but legally untenable. A pause. Do you understand me? The soldiers watching had gone completely silent. Not the silence of people who are uncomfortable. The silence of people who are witnessing something and understand that it will matter. Briggs said nothing. I'm going to take that as compliance, Dean said. Do not speak again unless I address you directly. He turned to the civilians from the lead aircraft, and the man with the briefcase opened it and began distributing documents. And those documents were the authenticated communication logs, the time-stamped evacuation request, the 18-minute delay, the denial, and the 11 words that Richard Briggs had sent to Lawrence Crane from a secondary channel while American operators were taking fire in a building that was failing around them. Request denied. If she loses people out there, problem solves itself. Dean looked at the documents in his hand. He looked at Briggs. And then he looked at the soldiers around them, the thousands of men and women who had gathered at the edges of this landing zone, who had stopped their day and come here because something in the air told them to, because 40 helicopters darkening the sky tells you something in a language older than words. Before we proceed, Dean said in a voice now calibrated to carry across the distance to where soldiers were watching, I think everyone here deserves to hear something. He nodded to the man with the briefcase. The man reached into his document case and removed a small audio device and connected it to the base communication system through a port that existed for exactly this kind of official military review process. And then the recording began to play. The voice that came through the base speakers first was Evelyn Carter's 14 hours into a mission, in a building taking fire with 2 of her operators down, and the extraction vehicle compromised, and the situation deteriorating in the specific methodical way that situations deteriorate when everything starts failing at once. Her voice was controlled, professional. She was requesting emergency evacuation. She was providing the casualty status, the operational position, the threat assessment. She was doing everything exactly right. Her voice was the voice of a commander who is managing a situation at the edge of manageable and has not crossed that edge yet and intends not to. And then there was silence. 18 minutes of silence compressed in the playback to something shorter, marked by a timestamp announcement that told every person listening exactly how long Briggs had taken. And then his voice, flat, administrative, unbothered, evacuation request denied, non-priority classification. Stand by for further guidance. The soldiers listening heard it. And then 11 seconds later, the secondary channel recording, the message to R7. The 11 words that had been composed and sent while Carter was still on the primary channel, waiting for a response that was not going to come. Request denied. If she loses people out there, problem solves itself. The silence that followed was not simply silence. It was the sound of thousands of people absorbing something that changed the shape of what they thought they knew, that turned a figure of institutional authority into something that had no word for it in military protocol, but had a very clear word for it in the simpler language of people who understand what it means to be left behind on purpose. Marcus Webb heard it standing 20 meters from the landing zone, and Diana Okafor was beside him, and neither of them said anything. Because what do you say when you hear the proof of what you suspected, and the proof is worse than the suspicion? Briggs stood in front of the gathered formation and did not look at anyone. He looked at the ground. He had the face of a man watching something very large come down on top of him and having run out of room to step back. Evelyn Carter stood beside General Dean and watched Richard Briggs with an expression that contained no triumph and no anger and no satisfaction of any visible kind. She watched him the way you watch a problem reach its conclusion, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to the moment after the decision has been made and the work of the decision is in the process of completing itself. She had told him on the tarmac 3 days ago that the worst mistake he ever made was not sending her away. It was forgetting who she was. He understood now. Every soldier on Camp Macall understood now, and it was only the beginning of understanding. The recording ended, and the silence that followed it was the kind of silence that has weight and texture and does not dissipate quickly. It settled over Camp Macall the way certain kinds of truth settle, not with a crash, but with a slow, irresistible pressure, the kind that gets into everything and changes the shape of what it touches. Thousands of soldiers stood in that silence and did not move, and the stillness of them was not the stillness of people waiting for something to happen. It was the stillness of people who were processing something that had already happened and were still catching up to the full dimension of it. General Dean let it breathe. He was a man who understood silence as a tool, who had learned over 34 years that the moments after a significant truth lands are not moments to fill, but moments to protect, because what people do with real information when they are given space to absorb it is more powerful than anything you can tell them to think. He stood with his hands behind his back, and he let the silence do its work. And he watched the faces of the soldiers around him and read in those faces everything he needed to know about how the recording had landed. He had seen disbelief on faces before. He had seen outrage. He had seen the particular expression that people wear when something they thought was one thing reveals itself to be its exact opposite. And that expression is not dramatic. It does not shout. It is quiet and internal, and it goes very deep. That was what he was looking at now. Briggs was still looking at the ground. Dean turned to face him, and when he spoke, his voice had not changed in volume or temperature, which somehow made it carry more authority than shouting ever could. "Colonel Briggs, look at me." It took Briggs 3 seconds to raise his eyes. 3 seconds is a long time when thousands of people are watching you take them. At 1400 hours on the 14th day of the operation designated Cedar Watch, Dean said you received an emergency evacuation request from a field commander with American operators in active contact. You classified that request as non-priority. You did not respond for 18 minutes. You then denied the request. Is that accurate? Briggs's jaw tightened. Sir, the operational parameters at the time indicated. Is that accurate, Colonel? Not a question. The absence of a question mark in his voice was deliberate and absolute. Briggs stopped. Yes, sir. During those 18 minutes, while you were failing to respond to an emergency evacuation request from operators in contact, you were engaged in a communication thread with the Pentagon Logistics Office regarding a ground vehicle maintenance budget. A pause. Briggs said nothing. Is that accurate? Sir, there were multiple simultaneous operational demands. Colonel? Dean's voice dropped half a register. Every person on this installation just heard the timestamps on that recording. Every person here knows exactly how long 18 minutes is. Do not insult the people standing around you by suggesting that a budget discussion constitutes a simultaneous operational demand of equivalent priority to American operators taking fire. Briggs closed his mouth. After denying the evacuation request, Dean continued, you sent a text communication through a secondary channel to a contact identified as R7, now confirmed as Deputy Director Lawrence Crane of the Pentagon Operational Oversight Division. The content of that communication was 11 words. He paused. He said the 11 words again slowly because some things need to be said more than once to be fully understood. Request denied. If she loses people out there, problem solves itself. He let that sit for a moment. Is that your communication, Colonel? The muscles in Briggs's face were doing something that was not quite any identifiable expression. It was the muscular activity of a man whose entire framework for understanding his position in the world is coming apart in real time and who has not yet found a new framework to replace it with. I want an attorney present before. You will have one, Dean said. Yeah, I am. That is your right and it will be honored. But that communication exists in an authenticated military archive with a clean chain of custody, and it carries your identifier, and no attorney is going to change what it says or what it means. He turned slightly, addressing not just Briggs now, but the entire formation of soldiers around him. What it means, he said at a volume that carried, is that a commander in a position of authority deliberately calculated that the deaths of American operators would serve his administrative convenience. That is not a protocol failure. That is not a chain of command issue. That is conduct unbecoming of any person wearing this uniform at any rank in any capacity. He turned back to Briggs. Colonel Richard Briggs, by the authority vested in me as Commander of United States Special Operations Command, you are hereby relieved of command of Camp Macall and all associated facilities effective immediately. Your authority on this installation ends at this moment. You will surrender your identification and your sidearm to the senior MP present. The senior MP present was Sergeant Kowalski, who had 11 years of military police experience and had spent the last 3 days carrying out Briggs's orders with professional neutrality. He stepped forward now with a different quality of movement, the movement of someone for whom the direction of duty has become suddenly and completely clear. And he stopped in front of Colonel Richard Briggs and held out his hand. Briggs looked at Kowalski's hand. Kowalski waited. The entire installation waited. Briggs reached up and unpinned his identification. He placed it in Kowalski's hand. He removed his sidearm from its holster, cleared it with the mechanical precision of muscle memory, and handed it over. And then Kowalski, who had on the morning of 3 days ago escorted Evelyn Carter to the gate of this installation on Briggs's order, who had stood on the tarmac and participated in something that the recording had now made clear, was an act of institutional injustice in service of deliberate negligence. Kowalski put Briggs's identification in his pocket and said in a voice that did not shake even though it should have, "Sir, you'll need to come with me." The soldiers watching did not cheer. They did not make any sound at all, which was in its own way the most devastating response possible because cheering can be dismissed as emotional reaction. But absolute silence, the silence of thousands of people watching a figure of authority be removed from that authority and choosing not to celebrate it, but simply to witness it with complete and total attention. That silence is judgment, and judgment that does not need to perform itself is the kind that sticks. Marcus Webb watched Briggs walk away between two MPs, and he felt something complicated that was not satisfaction. Satisfaction was too simple for what he felt. What he felt was more like the specific emotional quality of a wound being cleaned properly, which is not pleasant, but which is necessary, which hurts in a way that is different from the original injury, because it is the hurt of something being corrected rather than something being damaged. Diana Okafor put her hand on his arm. She did not say anything. He was grateful for that. Evelyn Carter watched Briggs leave and then turned away because she had not come here to watch him go. She had come here for something else, and the something else was standing 20 meters away in the person of Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb and Petty Officer First Class Diana Okafor, and 10 other people who had flown 8,000 miles with her and come back and stood on a tarmac and been told they were no longer her responsibility. She walked toward them. Marcus saw her coming, and something happened in his face that he would not have been able to describe, and that Diana would later say looked like the exact expression of a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. She stopped in front of him. "Sergeant Webb." "Commander." His voice was level, and it cost him something to make it level. "How's the arm?" "Functional, ma'am." "Diana." She looked at Okafor. "The ribs." "Healing," Diana said, "slowly." "Slowly is fine," Evelyn said. "Slowly means they're healing in the right direction." Marcus looked at her. He had 100 things he wanted to say, and he was a man who, when he had too many things to say, tended to say the most important one and leave the rest. "You said it on the tarmac. You said it was not about saving your career." "It wasn't," she said. "It was about him never being able to do it again." "To anyone," she said. "Not to any team, not to any operator, not to any field commander who makes an emergency call and deserves an answer within seconds, not within 18 minutes, and not with a denial." She paused. Briggs was going to keep doing what he did. Crane was going to build a framework that protected people like Briggs from accountability. That was going to keep happening until someone stopped it in a way that could not be quietly managed into a file and forgotten. So you stopped it, Marcus said. We stopped it, she said. You kept your people together. You followed regulations when everything in you was telling you to do something else. That mattered. Marcus looked at her for a moment. The helicopter's commander. 40 of them. 40, she confirmed, and there was something in the way she said it that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory. Who are you? He asked, not as a challenge, as a genuine question from a man who thought he knew the answer and was now understanding that he knew far less of it than he believed. She looked at him steadily. I am exactly who I told you I was on the first day. A field commander who believes that every person under her command deserves to come home, she paused. The rest of it is background. 23% of Reed Carter defense systems, Diana said quietly. She had done her own research. She was Diana Okafor. Of course she had. Evelyn looked at her without surprise. Background, she said again. Diana almost smiled. Some background. General Dean approached them, and the three of them came to attention, and Dean looked at Marcus and Diana with the specific evaluative attention of a flag officer who has reviewed personnel files and is now measuring the files against the people, and whatever he found in that measurement satisfied him because something in his bearing acknowledged it without making a performance of it. Your team held together under unusual pressure, he said to Marcus. That reflects command quality going up and unit quality going across. Both of those things are noted. He looked at Evelyn. Carter, walk with me. They walked away from the main formation far enough for privacy, and Dean spoke without preamble, which was his way. The Crane matter, his restructuring proposal. Yes, sir. I have already contacted the committee chair. The proposal is being suspended pending a full review of Crane's conduct in relation to this operation. The authenticated communication linking him to Briggs's evacuation denial will be central to that review. He paused. Crane will argue that his communication with Briggs was advisory and that he had no operational authority over the evacuation decision. He will lose that argument, Evelyn said. He will, Dean agreed, because the communication establishes that he was aware of the evacuation request, was aware of the potential for casualties, and communicated in terms that actively encouraged the denial. That is not advisory. That is complicit. He paused again longer. But the review will take time. These things always do. I know, she said. And in the meantime, there is the question of what comes next for you. He stopped walking. He turned to face her directly. The Pentagon is going to restore your credentials and clear every charge Briggs filed. That paperwork is already in motion and will be complete within 48 hours. Your command will be officially reinstated. He looked at her with the specific quality of a senior officer who is about to say something he has considered carefully. There are also conversations happening above my pay grade about what your return to operational status should look like. Evelyn said nothing, which was her way of indicating she was listening without interruption. You disrupted an active conspiracy between an installation commander and a senior Pentagon administrator, Dean said. You did it legally, methodically, and with enough precision that every element of the accountability process is clean. No procedural vulnerabilities, no evidentiary problems, nothing that a defense attorney can attack on process grounds. He paused. That is not simply field competence, Carter. That is a different order of capability. I had good people helping me, she said. You had Thomas Reed and his organization, Dean said. Who you had access to because of who you are outside this uniform. He looked at her steadily, which brings me to the conversation I was asked to have with you. She waited. There are people in this building and in the Pentagon who believe that your particular combination of capabilities, operational field experience, institutional relationships in the defense contractor world, and demonstrated ability to navigate accountability failures at the administrative level represents something that should be formalized. He paused. There is a proposal being drafted for a new oversight position within SOCOM, an independent accountability framework for special operations command decisions. Someone who has the authority to investigate the clearance to access the relevant communications and the standing in both the military and contractor communities to make findings stick. He looked at her. They are asking if you would consider it. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She thought about what the position would mean. Real authority, institutional standing, the ability to prevent what happened in hour 14 of Cedar Watch from happening to any other team, in any other building, in any other country. She thought about Crane and his restructuring proposal in the quiet, systematic way that men like Crane built frameworks that protected men like Briggs. And she thought about what it would mean to have a position from which those frameworks could be identified and dismantled before they embedded themselves in policy. She thought about all of that, and then she thought about Marcus Webb's arm in its sling on the tarmac and Diana Okafor's chin-up despite cracked ribs, and the 10 other people who had come down that ramp behind her and trusted her. And she thought about what it meant to stand beside people like that instead of above them, in the specific proximity of shared risk that no administrative position, however powerful, could replicate. "Sir," she said carefully, "I am honored by the consideration, and I believe that position needs to exist and that the person who fills it needs to be someone with exactly the background they are describing." "But," Dean said, "but I am not that person yet." She paused. "I have been a field commander for 12 years. I understand operational accountability from the inside, from the ground up, from inside the building while it is taking fire. That understanding is what made what I did in the last 3 days possible. I do not want to leave that level before I have given everything I have to give to the people who operate there." She looked at him steadily. "The position needs someone who has done the field work long enough that nobody can question whether they understand what the field costs. I am not done doing the field work." Dean looked at her for a long time. "You understand," he said, "that you are turning down something that most people would consider a significant career advancement." "I understand," she said, "that I am choosing to stay in the place where I am most useful to the people I am most responsible for." She paused. "The position will still need to be filled, and when the time comes, I will help identify the right person for it." Dean studied her face with the attention of a man taking a careful measurement. Then he nodded once with the quality of someone who has confirmed something he already suspected. "Reinstatement is effective in 48 hours, he said. "Your team has been notified. Post-mission medical clearances will be processed through the base medical facility beginning this afternoon." He paused. "And Carter, sir, what you did here today matters beyond this installation. The recordings are going to be used in the Crane review. The documentation of Briggs's conduct is going into the official record and will inform policy conversations about installation commander oversight of special operations missions." He paused. "You came here to make sure it could not be quietly managed into a file and forgotten." "Yes, sir." "It will not be," he said. He walked back toward the formation, and Evelyn stood for a moment where she was breathing the Carolina air, feeling the specific quality of something finished, not the triumphant finish of a story, but the functional finish of a problem correctly solved, which is quieter and more durable and matters for longer. Captain Foster Briggs' aide found her at 11:40 hours. He was 26 years old and had been performing professional neutrality in all morning, under conditions that severely tested it, and when he found her, he had an expression that had given up on neutrality and settled for honest uncertainty instead. "Ma'am," he said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it as someone who was in that office when the tower report came in this morning." Evelyn looked at him. "Go ahead, Captain." "When Briggs told me to send the MPs to the landing zone, I knew it was wrong. I knew before I left the room that it was wrong. And I went and did it anyway because he was my commanding officer, and I told myself that was the reason." He stopped. It was not a good enough reason. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said, "it wasn't, but you know that now. And knowing it is the beginning of being the kind of officer who makes a different choice next time." She paused. "The question is never whether you are in a situation where following a wrong order is easier than refusing it. The question is whether you know the difference between the two things clearly enough to make the right call when the cost of making it is real." Foster absorbed that. "How do you know," he asked, "when the cost is real? How do you know it's worth it?" She thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "You think about the person who bears the cost of you not acting," she said. "You make it specific. You give it a name. Abstraction is how wrong orders get followed. When you make it specific, when it is Marcus Webb's arm in a sling and Diana Okafor walking with cracked ribs and 12 people who trusted you with their lives, the calculation changes." Foster nodded slowly. He looked like someone who had just had a very important thing said to him in a moment when he was prepared to hear it. "Thank you, ma'am." "Do better," she said, not harshly, as a genuine instruction. "That is all anyone can do." He walked away, and she watched him go, and she thought that he probably would do better because he had the face of someone who was genuinely troubled by what he had done, and people who are genuinely troubled by wrong things tend to spend the rest of their careers being more careful about them, which is how institutions improve one person at a time. By 1400 hours, the 40 aircraft had completed their operational objectives and were beginning to cycle through departure sequences. The formation that had arrived as something singular and overwhelming was disaggregating back into its component elements, each aircraft returning to its authorized home station, each crew completing its mission and transitioning to standard post-mission protocol. Thomas Reed found Evelyn at 14:30 standing near the edge of the landing zone, watching the last of the aircraft prepare to lift. He was still in his civilian executive clothes, and he had the expression of a man who had spent the last several hours doing the work that his position required him to do, and was now for the first time allowing himself to simply be present in the moment. "Crane's attorney contacted my legal team at 1300, he said. Evelyn looked at him. Already. Thomas nodded. "He is claiming that the secondary channel communication was taken out of context, and that Crane's involvement in the evacuation decision was limited to an advisory capacity." He paused. "My legal team's response, which I reviewed and authorized, was to note that the authenticated timestamps, the clean chain of custody, and the content of the communication itself would be made fully available to the review committee, to the Inspector General's office, and to any other oversight body with jurisdiction, and that we looked forward to providing whatever additional documentation might assist in establishing the full context of the communication." Evelyn almost smiled. "How did his attorney respond?" "He asked for 2 days before we submitted anything." "What did you say?" "I said we would submit everything on the original schedule, which was tomorrow morning, and that Crane's attorney was welcome to review it at the same time as the committee." Thomas paused. He did not enjoy that answer. "No," she said, "he wouldn't." Thomas looked at her with the expression of someone who has known a person for a long time and is seeing them clearly in a particular moment. "You could have had a different life," he said quietly. "You walked away from everything to do this, and then you spent 12 years being extraordinary at it, and then a man who should never have had authority over you tried to erase it in a morning. And you spent 3 days in a motel room with a fragment wound in your shoulder, rebuilding it into something that could not be erased." He paused. "I have known a great many people in my life who are impressive. I have known very few who are what you are." She looked at him. "What am I unreasonably committed to the right thing," he said. She did consider smiling at that. She let herself. "Thank you, Thomas, for all of it." "Don't thank me," he said, and his voice had the same quality as when Dean had said those words, which suggested that the people who had helped her do this did not feel they were doing her a favor, but rather doing something that mattered in its own right, independently of any transaction between them. She understood that. She felt it in the same place she felt everything that mattered. At 1500 hours, the last of the 40 aircraft lifted from Camp Macall and banked north, and the sound of it filled the air for 30 seconds, and then diminished, and what was left was the ordinary sound of a military installation, in the afternoon training activity, in vehicle movement, and the ambient hum of an institution continuing to function. But something was different from the morning. The soldiers who had watched Briggs's identification go into Kowalski's hand, who had heard 11 words played through bass speakers in a dead man's voice, who had stood in absolute silence as a man was walked away from authority he had used to endanger American lives, those soldiers were moving through their afternoon carrying something they had not been carrying that morning. Not just the information, the understanding. The specific education of having witnessed what institutional betrayal looks like from the inside, and what genuine accountability looks like when it arrives, and what the difference between authority built on fear and authority built on something real looks like when the two things are placed directly next to each other. Marcus Webb was filling out his post-mission medical clearance paperwork in the base medical facility when his phone registered a text from an unsecured number he did not recognize. He looked at it. It was 3 words. "Paperwork's almost done." He looked at the words for a moment. He typed back 2. "We know." He set the phone down and returned to the paperwork and felt for the first time since the tarmac that the weight he had been carrying since that morning had distributed itself more evenly, the way weight distributes when you shift it from one point of contact to many, which is the structural principle behind both good architecture and good teams. Evelyn Carter stood on the ground of Camp Macall in the afternoon and breathed it in this particular air of this particular installation that had been hers for 4 years and that someone had tried to take from her 3 days ago, and she let herself feel the specific texture of having fought for something real and having won it not for herself, but for the 12 people who had trusted her, and for every operator who would come after them, and for the principle, which was not abstract but was as concrete and load-bearing as anything she had ever stood on, that every person who serves deserves a commander who fights for them with everything available. She had done that. She had done it with 40 helicopters and authenticated communication logs and a 4-star general and a CEO and 11 years of a contract that bore her name. She had done it above all because the alternative was unacceptable, and it would remain unacceptable. For as long as she wore this commitment, whatever form it took, and wherever it carried her, she would make sure of that. The 48 hours that General Dean had promised moved with the specific compressed weight of time that carries consequence. Evelyn spent the first night back on base in temporary officer quarters, a room that smelled like standard issue everything, and felt like the most comfortable place she had been in a week. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was hers again, or nearly hers, because the installation that had walked her to its gate 3 days ago was now an installation where she belonged, and belonging when you have had it taken from you and then returned feels different than it did before. It feels earned in a way it did not feel earned when it was simply assumed. She did not sleep immediately. She sat on the edge of the bunk and went through everything methodically the way she always processed significant events, not emotionally first, but factually building the sequence in order, checking each element against the others to make sure the structure was sound. Briggs relieved of command. Crane under review. 40 aircraft, all authorized, all legitimate, all gone home. The recordings played through base speakers to every soldier on the installation. The 11 words that would follow Richard Briggs for the remainder of whatever career remained to him, which was to say they would follow him out of his career entirely and into every context in which his name appeared afterward. The structure was sound. She allowed herself to feel it then in the quiet of the room with no audience and no operational requirement to manage her reaction. She felt the particular exhaustion of 3 days of sustained precision under pressure. The kind of exhaustion that is different from physical tiredness, because it lives in a different part of you, in the part that has been making high-stakes decisions continuously without the luxury of uncertainty. She felt the fragment wound in her shoulder, which had been patient and consistent in reminding her it existed throughout everything and was now in the quiet somewhat more insistent. She felt the residue of the tarmac, which was not gone simply because the situation had been resolved. Because things like that do not go away immediately. They become part of the sediment of your experience, and you carry them forward, and they change the shape of how you move through similar terrain in the future. She felt all of it, and then she lay down and closed her eyes and let the day finish itself. She was asleep in 4 minutes. At 800 the following morning, her phone showed a message from General Dean's Chief of Staff. Reinstatement paperwork complete. Credentials restored. Official notification to follow through command channels. She read it twice, set the phone down, and sat with the information for exactly 30 seconds, which was the amount of time she had decided to allow herself for the private acknowledgement of things that mattered before she stood and began moving. The formal reinstatement notification arrived through official channels at 0930, delivered by Captain Holloway from the base legal office, who had spent the previous day reviewing the evidentiary package and had arrived at conclusions that confirmed every flag he had raised in Briggs's case file and several additional ones he had not initially identified. He handed her the paperwork with the expression of a man who is relieved that the process has concluded correctly and is also, underneath the professional relief, quietly troubled by how close it had come to concluding differently. Lieutenant Commander Carterman, he said, all charges and violations have been formally dismissed. Your credentials and command authority are fully restored, effective as of 0800 this morning. He paused. I want to say something, ma'am, that is not part of the official process. She waited. I flagged 3 items in Briggs's case file on the first day, he said. The evidentiary weight was thin, and the construction of the case was backward conclusion first, and then documentation, which is not how you build a legitimate case. I flagged it, I sent the flag to his office. I did not receive a response, and I told myself that was normal processing delay. He looked at her steadily. It was not normal. I knew it was not normal, and I did not push harder because he was the base commander and I was a captain in his legal office. And I made a calculation about the cost of pushing harder against someone who outranked me by a significant margin. Evelyn looked at him. And now I understand that calculation was wrong, he said. The cost of not pushing harder is borne by you and by your team, not by me. I made a cost calculation and assigned the cost to someone else without their knowledge or consent. He paused. That is not what this uniform is supposed to mean. She was quiet for a moment. He was the second person in 2 days to come to her with something like this. First Foster and now Holloway, two men who had been in proximity to Briggs's conduct and had made calculations. They now understood differently. And this was, she realized, part of what the recordings had done and what the formation had done and what the public nature of the accountability had done. It had made the cost of complicity visible to the people who had been complicit at the margins, the people who had not done the worst thing but had not done enough to prevent it, and that visibility was its own form of accountability, quieter than Briggs's arrest, but in some ways more durable. Holloway, she said, you flagged it. That matters. You identified the problem and put it in writing. The next step is understanding why you stopped there, and it sounds like you understand that now. She paused. Use it. The next time you flag something and the response is silence. Silence is not an answer. Silence is a decision by the person who chose not to respond, and that decision has to be escalated. That is what the process exists for. He nodded. Yes, ma'am. He held out her credentials, her identification, her authorization documents. Everything that Briggs had taken and thrown on a concrete surface. These belong to you. She took them. She did not look at them immediately. She held them in her hand for a moment and felt their weight, which was not the weight of the physical objects, but the weight of what they represented, and then she clipped her identification to her uniform and felt the specific small mechanical click of it settling into place. And that click was the most satisfying sound she had heard in 4 days. Marcus Webb found out about the reinstatement from Diana, who had been monitoring official channels with the focused attention she applied to everything she considered operationally relevant. And his response, which Diana observed and cataloged for future reference, was to exhale slowly through his nose in the way that he exhaled when something that had been uncertain resolved itself in the right direction, and then to say nothing at all for 30 seconds, and then to say one word. Good. Diana looked at him. That's your response. Good. What would you like me to say? Something commensurate with 40 helicopters and a 4-star general and authenticated communication logs and 3 days in a roadside motel with a fragmented wound, Diana said. Marcus considered this. Good, he said again with slightly more emphasis. Diana made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the same territory. They were in the base medical facility for their final post-mission clearance evaluations. Marcus's arm being assessed for return to full-duty status and Diana's ribs being measured against their healing timeline when Evelyn walked in. She was in uniform for the first time since the tarmac, and the effect of seeing her in uniform in that room was not dramatic. Nobody stood at attention or made a formal acknowledgement, but something shifted in the quality of the air. The way air shifts when something that has been displaced returns to its proper position. She looked at Marcus's arm first. What's the assessment? 6 weeks to full duty. Well, he said, light duty cleared immediately. Diana, 4 weeks before they will clear me for anything that involves impact or compression, Diana said. Desk work and light physical in the meantime. Both of you are going to follow those timelines exactly, Evelyn said. Not a suggestion, said. Ma'am, I have done nothing but follow timelines since you left, Marcus said. I have been a model of regulatory compliance. That's concerning, she said. You're usually more creative than that. I was conserving energy, he said, for when things return to normal. She looked at him. Are things normal? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Define normal. Our team, together, mission capable. Then yes, he said, within medical clearance parameters, which I will respect entirely. She almost smiled. I'll believe it when I see it. She gathered her team that afternoon, all 12 of them in various states of medical clearance and healing, convened in the briefing room that had been their standard meeting space for 4 years. And they came in the particular way that her team came to things that mattered without formality, but with attention settling into the room, with the practiced ease of people who have occupied the same space in the same configuration many times and know exactly how it should feel. She stood at the front and looked at them, 12 specific faces, 12 specific people, each one of them carrying the residue of a mission that had gone harder than planned and a homecoming that had been the opposite of what they deserved, and she let herself look at them for a moment before she spoke. I want to say something to each of you individually, and I want to do it now before the official process catches up and turns everything into documentation. She paused. You held together under conditions that would have fractured units with less in common than we have. You followed regulations when following regulations was the hardest available option. You trusted me when you had no visibility into what I was doing or whether it was going to work. Another pause. I have led a lot of people in my career. I have never led better people than the 12 of you. The room was quiet. Petty Officer Second Class Reyes, who was 24 years old and had been with the team for 8 months and had taken his first serious operational injury during CDAR watch, a blast concussion that had cleared his medical review that morning, raised his hand with the specific quality of someone who has something to say and is not sure of the protocol for saying it. Go ahead, Reyes, she said. Ma'am, he stopped, started again. I want to ask something that I have been thinking about since the tarmac. Ask it. When Briggs walked you to the gate, he said you told him the worst mistake he made was not sending you away. It was forgetting who you are. He paused. At the time, I thought you meant something about your record or your capability. But watching everything that happened after, I'm thinking you meant something different. She waited. You meant who you actually are, he said, outside the uniform, the company, the contracts, the 40 aircraft. He paused. Why didn't you ever tell us? The room leaned in slightly, not physically, but in the quality of its attention, because this was the question that every person in that briefing room had been carrying since the formation landed, and Reyes had asked it because he was young enough to still ask the questions that more experienced people had learned to leave unasked. Evelyn looked at him steadily. Because it was not relevant, she said, to what we do here, in this room, in the field. You do not need to know what I own, or what I left behind, or what I could have been doing instead of this. What you need to know is whether I will make the right call, when it matters whether I will fight for you when the fight is hard, and whether I will bring you home. She paused. Everything else is background. But it became relevant, Reyes said. It was the thing that made everything possible. It was a tool, she said. Like any other tool, you use what you have. What I had was unusual, but the reason I used it the way I used it was not unusual. The reason was sitting in this room right now. She looked at all of them, one face at a time, the way she had always done when she needed them to understand that she was not speaking in abstractions. I would have found another way. It might have taken longer. It might have been messier. But I would have found a way, because leaving what happened on that tarmac unaddressed was not an option I was willing to accept. Staff Sergeant Webb was watching her with the expression she knew well, the one that meant he was filing something carefully for long-term retention. The position Dean offered you, he said, the oversight role. She looked at him. How do you know about that? Diana, he said without apology. Diana did not look apologetic. I turned it down, Evelyn said. The room shifted. Several people exchanged glances. Why, Bob? Reyes asked. He was on a roll and apparently not stopping. Because I am not finished here, she said simply. And because the people who need oversight positions are people who have been in rooms like this one long enough to understand exactly what the cost of bad oversight decisions is. I am still accumulating that understanding. I will know when I have enough of it. She paused. And because you are my team, and my team is operational, and the mission is not over. The silence that followed this was different from the silences earlier in the week. It was not the silence of shock or processing or disbelief. It was the silence of 12 people absorbing something that confirmed what they had already believed and finding that confirmation more meaningful than they had expected. Then the door opened and General Dean walked in unannounced, which was his prerogative and which he exercised without ceremony, moving into the room with the self-contained authority of a man who does not need a room to prepare itself for him. He looked at the assembled team and nodded once at Evelyn. I wanted to deliver this in person, he said, and he was holding a document case that he handed to Evelyn directly. the official notification of the SOC-OM review outcome, and the preliminary findings on the Crane matter. She opened the case. The first document was what Dean had promised. Reinstatement, full restoration, all charges dismissed. The formal record corrected. She had already known this. The second document was what she had not expected. She read the first paragraph. She read it again. "Sir," she said, her voice was carefully level. "This is a citation." "It is," Dean said, "for the operation. For leadership under fire for decisions that preserve the lives of your entire team in conditions that would have justified different decisions, and for conduct that upon review represents the standard that Special Operations Field Command should aspire to." He looked at her. "Your 3 deviations from approved parameters have been formally reclassified as exercises of authorized field commander discretion. They are now in the official record as positive examples of the kind of judgment that the special operations community trains for and that administrative oversight should protect rather than punish." The room was very still. Additionally, Dean said the Cedar Watch operational review is being used as the primary case study in a new training module for installation commanders regarding their responsibilities under the Emergency Evacuation Protocol. The module will be mandatory for every installation commander with oversight authority over special operations elements. He paused. "Your evacuation request, the response time, and the consequences of that response time will be part of the permanent training record." Marcus Webb made a sound that was not a word. "Sergeant Webb," Dean said, turning to him, "something to add?" "No, sir," Marcus said in a voice that was performing composure with visible effort. "Good." Dean looked at the team. "What this unit did on that mission and what your commander did in the days that followed will have consequences that extend well beyond this installation and this case. The Crane proposal is dead. I want to be clear about that. It is not suspended. It is not under review with the possibility of revision. It is finished. The framework he was building, the one that would have given administrative officers authority over field evacuation decisions, will not be built." His voice had the quality of something being nailed in place. "The accountability review that Carter initiated will result in policy changes that protect field commanders' authority to make emergency decisions without administrative interference from personnel who have never operated in a field environment. Those changes will be implemented before the end of the fiscal year." Reyes was looking at Evelyn with an expression that had gone beyond the question he had asked and arrived somewhere that did not need a question anymore. "Ma'am," he said quietly. She looked at him. "The worst mistake he made," Reyes said slowly, "was not sending you away. It was forgetting who I am," she said. "I understand now," he said. "All of it." She nodded. "Good." Dean stayed for 20 minutes, spoke with several members of the team individually, and left as directly as he had arrived. In his wake, the room had the specific quality of space that has been touched by something significant and is now settling back into the shape of the work, because the work is what persists after the significant moments pass, and the people in this room were people defined by the work. The twist came at 1600 hours, and it came from Thomas Reed, and it came through Evelyn's encrypted channel in a message that was 3 sentences long. Crane's attorney made a second contact this afternoon. They are not contesting the findings. They are requesting that Crane be permitted to submit a voluntary statement to the review committee confirming that the restructuring proposal was developed with the intent of protecting administrative convenience over field operator safety in exchange for a reduced finding in his conduct review. Evelyn read it twice. She called Thomas. "He is cooperating," Thomas said when he answered. "Fully, voluntarily." His attorney convinced him that fighting the authenticated documentation was unwinnable, and that the only path that preserved any possibility of a dignified exit from his position was to acknowledge the conduct and let the review committee determine the appropriate outcome. What does he get in exchange? A reduced finding, no criminal referral provided his full cooperation is genuine and complete. He loses his position. He loses his security clearance. He retires not in disgrace technically, but with a record that makes his future in any defense-adjacent capacity essentially non-existent. A pause. "Evelyn, he is also providing a full accounting of every other administrative officer he was aware of who had participated in similar conduct, specifically other instances where installation commanders had used administrative processes to undermine Field Commander authority over special operations elements. She was quiet. How many? She asked. His preliminary list has 6 names, Thomas said. 6 other cases where the pattern Briggs used building a paper case against a field commander who had circumvented administrative obstruction was applied or attempted. 6. She had known it was not only Briggs. She had known from the moment she understood what Briggs had done that Briggs was a symptom rather than a disease. But knowing it abstractly and hearing the number were different things. The 6 cases, she said, are any of them still active? 2 of them involve field commanders who are currently operational, Thomas said. One of whom filed an emergency performance review challenge 14 months ago that has been sitting in administrative review ever since. Sitting in administrative review, she said, because someone with the authority to delay it chose to delay it. The review committee will have Crane's full statement by end of week, Thomas said. All 6 cases will be open for independent review. SOCOM has already been notified. She stood very still. 6 people. 6 field commanders who had been through variations of what she had been through, some of whom might still be in the middle of it, carrying the weight of institutional obstruction without the particular combination of resources that had allowed her to dismantle it in 3 days. 6 people who had trusted the system to eventually correct itself and had been waiting longer than they should have had to wait. Thomas, she said, the 2 who are currently operational, I want their files. A pause. Evelyn, you are just reinstated. Dean will assign. I am not going to do anything official, she said. I am going to read the files. I am going to understand the situations. And then I am going to make sure the right people are looking at them with the right urgency. She paused. That is not overstepping. That is doing the work. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I will have the files to you within the hour. She ended the call and sat with the information feeling the weight of it, which was not the weight of a burden, but the weight of responsibility, and responsibility that is genuine and accepted rather than assigned and performed feels different. It does not crush. It orients. It tells you which direction to move and gives you a reason to move in it that is larger than personal interest and smaller than abstraction. Exactly the right size. Specific enough to be real and significant enough to matter. She went back to her team at 1700. They were still in the briefing room. They had ordered food, actual base cafeteria food that arrived in the utilitarian containers of institutional catering, and was consumed with the specific lack of ceremony of people who have operated in field conditions long enough to regard any food that did not come from a vacuum-sealed packet as genuinely good. Reyes had found a deck of cards somewhere. Diana was watching him play with the evaluative attention she gave to everything, apparently assessing his shuffling technique. Evelyn sat down at the table. Webb looked at her. Something else happened, he said, not a question. He could read her with the accuracy of 4 years of close operational proximity. Crane is cooperating, she said, fully, and there are 6 other cases. Variations of what happened here. 2 of them active. The card game paused. 6, Diana said. 6 confirmed, Evelyn said. Possibly more. What happens to them, Reyes asked. The review committee will open independent reviews on all 6. SOCOM has been notified. The right institutional processes are engaged. She paused. And I have requested the files on the 2 active cases. Marcus looked at her with an expression that was not surprise. Because you want to make sure the right people are looking at them with the right urgency. Yes. Which means you are going to be doing work that technically falls outside your reinstated operational authority, he said. I am going to be reading files, she said, and talking to people, which is not outside any authority I am aware of. Marcus almost smiled. Of course, Dwayne. The mission, Diana said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else, is not over. It is not, Evelyn confirmed. It is significantly larger than it was this morning, and we are going to do the work. The room was quiet for a moment, and then Reyes resumed shuffling the deck, and Diana resumed evaluating his technique, and Marcus Webb leaned back in his chair with the settled quality of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to be, and Evelyn Carter sat at the table with her team and breathed in the specific air of that room which smelled like institutional food and worn upholstery and the accumulated hours of 12 people who had chosen to be exactly where they were. At 1900 hours, Thomas's files arrived on the encrypted channel. She opened the first one. She read it with the focused attention of a field commander, assessing terrain, identifying obstacles, calculating approaches, building the operational picture from available information with the particular quality of mind that does not need everything to be certain before it begins to understand what needs to be done. She read the second one. She set both files down and looked at the ceiling for a moment, thinking. Then she picked up her phone and called General Dean. He answered on the second ring. Carter. Sir, the 2 active cases in Crane's preliminary list. I have the files. A pause. Thomas Reed moves quickly. He does, she said. Sir, the first case involves a field commander who has been under administrative review for 14 months. Her emergency performance challenge has been sitting in a queue managed by one of the other names on Crane's list. She is operational, but her command authority is formally constrained pending review outcome. Her team is aware of the constraint, and it is affecting operational confidence. You've been reading for 2 hours, Dean said, and you have already identified the mechanism. The mechanism is the same one Briggs used, she said. Build a paper case, delay the review process, constrain authority while the constraint is technically procedurally justified. Eventually, the field commander either accepts a reduced role or resigns. She paused. She has not done either. No, Dean said. She has not. She has been waiting. A pause. I was already planning to prioritize both cases for the review committee. What I was not planning was to have someone who has just been through this exact process in the last 72 hours advising me on the mechanism. I can be useful, sir. You are always useful, Carter. That is not the question. He paused. The question is whether you can be useful on this while remaining within your reinstated operational parameters and not giving anyone grounds to suggest that your involvement is irregular. I can, she said. I will do nothing official. I will advise informally. I will make sure that people making decisions understand what they are looking at from the perspective of someone who has just lived through it. Another pause longer. Within those parameters, Dean said finally. Yes. Send me your analysis of both files by 800 tomorrow. Yes, sir. She ended the call. Marcus was watching her from across the table. He had not left. None of them had left. 8 o'clock tomorrow, he said. Analysis of 2 case files, she said. Tonight? Tonight. He nodded. He stood up. He rolled his non-injured shoulder once. Then we should get started. She looked at him. We. You read fast, he said. I ask good questions. Diana cross-references everything. Reyes makes coffee. He looked at Reyes. Can you make coffee? Reyes looked slightly offended. I can absolutely make coffee. Then we are equipped, Marcus said. Evelyn looked at her team, these 12 specific people in this specific room, and she felt something that did not have a simple name, the compound feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be among exactly the people you are supposed to be among, doing exactly the work that matters, and knowing all 3 of those things simultaneously and completely. She opened the first file on her laptop and set it where the team could see. All right, she said, let's get to work. And they did, because this was who they were, because this was what they did, because the mission was never just the mission you were assigned. The mission was every person behind the person in front of you, and every team behind that team, and every field commander who had ever made an emergency call in a building taking fire, and deserved an answer that came fast and came clean, and came from someone who understood that there are no acceptable losses when the losses have names. Evelyn Carter had learned that lesson in a way that had cost her something real. She had paid that cost, and she had converted it into something that would outlast the payment, something that would protect people she had never met, and would never meet, something that was already in motion and would continue moving long after this room this night, this particular gathering of 12 people around a table that smelled like institutional food and good work. She had been sent away. She had come back with 40 helicopters and everything that mattered, and she was not finished yet. She was never going to be finished, because the work that genuinely matters never finishes. It only deepens and grows and becomes more important the longer and more faithfully you give yourself to it. That was what real command was. That was what it had always been. And Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Carter fully reinstated fragment wound healing team around her files open, coffee arriving, mission ongoing, understood that more completely than she had ever understood anything in her life. The mission was not over. It never would be, and she would not have had it any other way.